Hello, I'm Jelaine Schmidt, Director of the University of Virginia Democracy Initiative's Memory Project. At the UVA Democracy Initiative, we facilitate public conversations, events, and projects which reflect upon and promote democratic values and practices. The Memory Project examines how collective memory is produced and reproduced. We seek to participate in and catalyze that process through our support for educational initiatives, public history and commemorative events, and the production of media and the arts. The Memory Project is a proud supporter of the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center's innovative Swords into Plowshares proposal, which aims to melt down Charlottesville's recently removed statue of Robert E. Lee in order to use the bronze material to create public art. Together with my colleagues from the UVA Democracy Initiative's Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab, we're pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's event, Down with the Confederacy, Lessons from Black Activists. In part due to the actions of our guests, Bree Newsom Bass and Emil Little, there's been a robust debate about the placement of Confederate symbols in public spaces and the counter efforts to remove these symbols. This debate is not new, as our moderator Clint Smith has documented in his New York Times #1 best-selling book, How the Word is Passed. From the inception of memorializing the Civil War in the late 19th century, Black activists, intellectuals, and journalists such as Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, and John Mitchell fought a rearguard action against the lost cause nostalgia preferred by defeated white Southerners. The lost cause version of public memory of the Civil War effaced the reason for the war, the nation's long conflict over slavery. In so doing, the lost cause minimized Black humanity, signaling that Black lives did not matter. The Confederate monuments and symbols broadcast to Black Americans that the promises of citizenship did not apply to us. Opposition to Confederate statues and Black activism to remove them has recurred in waves, most recently in the era of the Black Lives Matter movement. Bree Newsom Bass is an American filmmaker, musician, speaker, and activist from North Carolina, where she continues her work as an artist and grassroots community organizer. She's one of the founders of The Tribe, a grassroots organizing collective created in the aftermath of the 2014 uprising in Ferguson that was instrumental in organizing the removal of South Carolina's Confederate flag in 2015. She is best known for her act of civil disobedience on June 27, 2015, when she was arrested for removing the Confederate flag from the South Carolina State House grounds in the aftermath of the Charleston shooting. The resulting publicity put pressure on South Carolina state officials to remove the flag, and it was taken down permanently on July 10, 2015. Emil Little is an anti-racist activist who smeared their blood and red ink on the Silent Sam Confederate monument at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in spring 2018 in order to expose the bloody foundation on which white supremacy is built. Subsequently, the UNC administration and Board of Governors formed a mobile anti-protest police force. This did not deter UNC student anti-racism activists who, in August 2018, pulled down Silent Sam. When the University of North Carolina administration planned to construct a $5 million mausoleum for the now toppled statue, Emil called for a successful student strike to oppose these plans. Clint Smith is a poet and staff writer at The Atlantic who reflects upon race and politics in the United States. He's the author of the narrative nonfiction book, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America, which was a #1 New York Times bestseller. He is also an educator and currently teaches writing and literature in the DC Central Detention Facility. He hosts the YouTube series, Crash Course Black American History. I will turn things over to Clint to guide our discussion.
For me, it's a real honor and pleasure to be here spending time with two activists whose work is what makes my work possible. I mean, my book, How the Word is Passed, is inspired by the work of activists like these two who have taken into their own hands a thoughtful sense and grasp of the historical context that animates why so many of these statues have been erected across the country, and recognize not only with their actions, but with the sort of praxis that shapes the sort of actions that they take, why it is important to create moments and to create spectacle that allows us to see these images and to see this iconography for what it is. And for me, part of the reason I started my book, and part of why I think it's relevant to this conversation, is that, I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana. And in 2017, I watched my city take down two Confederate statues, or several Confederate statues that have been erected for decades, statues of Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, P.G.T. Beauregard. And as I was watching these statues come down, I was thinking about, what did it mean that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway? That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy? That my parents still live on a street today named after someone who owned over 150 enslaved people? Because the thing is, we know that symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols. They're reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy, and public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. And that's not to say that taking down a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee is going to suddenly erase the racial wealth gap, but it is to say that it helps us recognize that all of these things are part of an ecosystem of ideas, an ecosystem of narratives, an ecosystem of stories that help us understand what has happened throughout American history, what has happened to different groups throughout American history, how to understand the harm that has been done to these different groups throughout American history, and thus better positions us to make amends for the harm that has been done to people across generations, and across this country's history. And so for me, when I began the project of writing this book, I was trying to get a sense of, well, how is my own city, how is New Orleans telling this story of itself, or failing to tell this story of itself? It's a city that, the historian Walter Johnson said, what he says of it is that the whole city is a memorial to slavery. It's in the levees enslaved people built. It's in the roads enslaved people paved. It's in the buildings enslaved people constructed. It's in the unmarked graves where enslaved people are buried. And that's the story of New Orleans, but it's also the story of so many places across this country. The scars of slavery are etched into the landscape of this country everywhere. I wrote my book about 9 different places, but it could have been written about 100,000 in mine. And I think there's no place that exemplifies the struggle and the battle and the questions that are brought up when we think about Confederate iconography, when we think about history, when we think about the Confederacy, when we think about Black history and its relationship in pushing back against the sort of lost cause mythology that has been propagated and perpetuated over the course of generations. Charlottesville is the epicenter of that in so many ways. And it's so important, I think, to recognize that we're in this moment, that there's a unique and special opportunity that the UVA Memory Project and its co-sponsor, the Jefferson School Heritage Center, have this opportunity to, with their proposal, to literally melt the statue of a man who led an army predicated on maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery, right? And I think the symbolism of that is so powerful. Each place, I think, needs to make decisions about what they're going to do with their Confederate iconography, what they're going to do with these pieces of their landscape that have been a part of their community for so long. But I think there's also a moment to recognize the specific sort of harm that the Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville has caused, specifically as the site of the 2017 Unite the Right rally, which was emblematic of so much of the sort of white supremacist backlash that we've been experiencing over the past few years. And so I'm thrilled to be here and have this conversation with 2 activists who've been thinking and working and organizing at the forefront of this. So if Bree and Emil can come on the screen, I'd love to get our conversation started. Hello, hello. So just for some backstory, and some background for folks who might be coming to this conversation and don't necessarily have a whole lot of context about what brought each of you both to your sort of intellectual work and the praxis that animates that work, but also the specific action that each of you have largely become known for. I would love to talk about not only the experience of doing the action and like what you were feeling emotionally, but like what was the sort of what was the emotional and psychological sensibilities that like animated that decision? Like what was it that said this is something that I have to do and I want to do it in this way versus in another way? Because I'd also like to hear about like how you decided to do the specific type of action that you did and what your hope for the action would be, and how that relates to what actually ended up happening. So maybe Bree, you can start us off.
Sure. Really glad to be here, by the way, having this this conversation. In my situation, the Confederate flag that was on display there at the Capitol in South Carolina, that had long been a point of controversy. I'm sure that's the case with pretty much all of the Confederate symbology, because there was never a time where everyone was in agreement, obviously, about the display of these symbols. The flag there in South Carolina was raised in the 60s at the height of the civil rights movement, not long after the Friendship 9 protest in Rock Hill, a sit-in protest there. So it was, very clearly a sign of opposition to the civil rights movement. I think there were several other states that similarly raised a Confederate flag around that particular time. And people had protested it in various different ways for decades. The NAACP had a boycott of the state of South Carolina over the display. I know NCAA was one organization that honored that boycott in some ways by not hosting championship games in the state of South Carolina. And then in the year 2000, they reached somewhat of a compromise, I guess you could call it, where they moved the flag from the dome of the Capitol, where they had raised it in the 60s, to the lawn. But at that point in time, they wrote into law that the flag couldn't be lowered for any reason unless there was a 2/3 approval in the State House. So that was how we ended up with this horrific visual in 2015, in the aftermath of the shootings at Emmanuel AME, where South Carolina lowered the United States flag to half-staff, but then had the Confederate flag still raised to the top of the pole. I remember there was particularly one moment in time where they were actually parading Clementa Pinckney's casket through the Capitol, because he was not only the pastor of Emmanuel AME, but also a state senator. And so they gave him like a proper state funeral, had his casket on display in the rotunda, and it just brought home again the meaning of that symbol. I think what offended me, in addition to everything else, was just how it highlighted the disregard, right, for our lives as Black people. The fact that in the aftermath of what had happened, that we had so much of the national focus and discussion was on the display of the flag, not what are the circumstances that led to a white man in his 20s being so virulently racist that he decides to go into a church and murder people, right? Not discussing, kind of like to your point, Clint, about what does it mean that you grew up in a place surrounded by this symbology, not, trying to draw connections between the display of the Confederate flag and the conditions in South Carolina in 2015, but just on whether or not they would lower the flag. And so I think that, for myself, for the group of people I was working together with, when we came together and decided to take it down, that was our first question was, do we wait on South Carolina on the legislature to go through their process? And we decided no, because the process itself was invalid, right? The decision that led to the raising of the flag in the first place was invalid. This all-white legislature that made this decision at a time when Black people didn't have, voting protection and couldn't really have a say. This idea that we had to wait for 2/3 of the legislature to essentially decide that our lives mattered. There was an indignity to it all. And so we felt that that was the exact kind of situation where you take direct action, not only to like make the statement of how the law was unjust, but the fact that we have the power as people to change that. We do not have to wait on these oppressive institutions to determine when we get to participate in humanity, essentially, right? And so that was the whole point, was to demonstrate that kind of defiance, and also to demonstrate that kind of defiance against fear as well, not just the institutions, but the kind of terrorism that Dylann Roof engaged in Charleston, South Carolina, which is part of such a long history of that kind of terrorism, to go out in broad daylight and, climb the pole, which we had to do because of the way that they had constructed it. But to do that in such a way that showed that, we are not afraid. We're not going in someplace at night like Dylann Roof had and running away, but we are showing that we are not going to be terrorized in this way.
Thank you. Emil?
Hello, thank you for having me. It's really nice to be in conversation with Clint and Bree as well. Just to maybe begin, I will say that my story as to why I came to paint a monument in blood is interesting, but I think the origins are not that unique for a lot of Black students in predominantly white institutions. I grew up, I'm from Columbus, Ohio. I'm not from the South, but I am. My family is from the South. And the Confederacy is a part of our history. But I went to predominantly white schools, private schools on scholarship, which I was often reminded of. The Confederate flag was not something I hadn't seen. It was actually in my high school geometry teacher's class. And he was in Ohio, and he said it was because of states' rights. And a lot of the experiences I got out of that, and then going on to a predominantly white college, then going on to studying Chinese history at UNC, is that this is the only place where you will be valued. You, a kind of poor Black kid who might be kind of smart, will ever be valued. Nothing else you do will be valued, and our respect is the most worthy respect. And that was important to me because I thought, I felt education is something that I can empower myself through. And then, coming into those institutions and being constantly reminded that you don't actually belong, you won't be accepted. And in fact, you were never accepted here, historically, was, happened everywhere in Columbus, Ohio, in Brunswick, Maine, and at UNC. You're walking on a campus where people are, using your face for diversity posters, for admissions, and there are buildings that you're studying in, where you're eating in, that are named after people who would have lynched you, who made their money on the sale of Black children, and I think that profound contradiction really affected me, going into kind of, what happened with the monument at UNC, Silent Sam. After Charlottesville, after Unite the Right in Charlottesville, there was a protest around UNC's monument because it is similarly very tall, centered at the forefront of campus, and is what UNC is known for. And white supremacists had been visiting that monument for quite some time, before Unite the Right, and gathering there with nooses tied to Confederate flags. And Black students were getting emails from each other and even from staff about, hey, maybe it's not a good weekend to go out because there's these neo-Confederates are going to be on campus. And so going into that, there was a rally that a bunch of students put together. And although I didn't see many Confederates there, their main opponents were the school's police, which to me was another factor. I'm coming into this school and I'm thinking, the school's going to have our back on this because the students don't want this monument here. They know what it's about. And, the school might say it has its hands tied, but surely they're not going to, suppress their students. Lo and behold, I'm watching police shove, students, laughing at them, mocking them, hating them, coming up in riot gear with assault rifles to a rally that's mostly undergrads. And then, the sit-in that formed around Silent Sam was actually surveilled by an undercover UNC police officer who pretended to be a veteran who was, asking us very specific questions about our health histories, our families, things that, why would the university want to gather these things on us? Why is it doing this? Why is it targeting its own students? And I know down the street, there's a free speech trial going on, but I want to make sure that people know also about this. Everything that went on about Silent Sam is exactly about free speech too, and the suppression of anti-racist free speech, which I think is a much more common issue and I think is very little talked about. But, you know, for me, I was a part of the sit-in for a year. We passed out information that the history department made, that I made, which was part of my duty as a you know, a grad student and a teaching assistant at UNC. Historical facts about the monument, similarly to the monument in Charlottesville, you know, was put up during Jim Crow by people who wanted to also, in my opinion, which is also significant, erase history on both ends. And that's what white supremacy represents. It's not even necessarily the honoring of white history, because you never see any statues to the Maroons, who were Confederate deserters who joined with slaves to fight the Confederates in swamps. You don't see, you know, statues of James Longstreet or much praise of him by the same Confederate supporters. And I'm not exactly praising him, but he was Robert E. Lee's second in command. And he joined after the Confederacy lost to support freedmen and their right to vote. So to me, you know, this is a profound contradiction as someone who's coming here to study history, and maybe on someone who's neurodiverse and really truly believes in truth and justice. And you know, coming into my action, Silent Sam, that wasn't the first time it was vandalized or painted. It was, you know, I poured blood and red ink on it. But supposedly the first time it was vandalized was the day after Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, and someone spray painted KKK on it. And that was cleaned up. And then in 2015, someone wrote, "Who is Sandra Bland?" and KKK again on the statue, and it was immediately cleaned up. And so you have this literal monument, armed boy soldier pointing north, but also pointing at the historically North and Black neighborhood in Chapel Hill, you know, towering, this figure that's covered in Black blood, that's being whitewashed as well. I mean, that is really what white supremacy is. It's an irrational historical take. You know, if you're so proud to have this armed, you know, soldier still standing for this cause, why not depict for what he stood for, which is, you know, the murder of Black people and their enslavement. And so for me, that's what I'm thinking going into the action. Maybe this is something I talk about this because, you know, I came into UNC as a Chinese historian, and a lot of people are like, why are you doing all this with American history? But, you know, all over the world, there is oppression and there are people fighting it. And when I was in China, I was in southern China during a series of migrant protests by migrant workers who were being heavily abused by local police officers. And they threw like fake blood or pig's blood on a police sub-bureau station, basically. And it was like everyone stopped to look at this and to, you know, observe and be like, whoa, what's going on? And immediately, you know, like these men are taken in and beaten and dealt with, and people come out to clean up. But, you know, the next day, even though there was no blood, people were like, this has been tainted. They want to avoid it. People are standing outside forming a crowd. And so for me, I knew that I was going to be arrested. And yet I also knew that doing it during the day would mean that people would see the red ink and blood. There'd be photographs of it. Blood, or, you know, even the minor presence of blood has this weird magical quality that people believe in. We believe that when something is bloodied, it's tainted. Something about it is different. And so for me, you know, I think as we will get in more into this conversation, there was the act of being strategic about exposing the irrationality of white supremacy and being really fed up with the irrationality of white supremacy.
And I think that the blood was such a profound image, right? Because part of this is also, and something that both of you touched on was like, this isn't something that we want to do secretly. This isn't something that we want to do under the cover of night. This isn't something that we want to do and hide our faces or hide our names. I mean, you both did it There were people taking photos of you. There was extensive media coverage. And it was almost a rejection, like with your bodies, of the ways, and with your bodies and your faces and the time and context in which it was done, of the way that white supremacy has like attempted to hide itself, I think, for so long, and has attempted to, whether it be the veil over the hood of a Ku Klux Klan member, or whether it be the way that, the people who would smile in your face. I've just been working on the story for The Atlantic on the history of lynching in Maryland, and the way that people, there would be Black people who went to the grocery stores of white folks who would then, and like bought the milk and eggs from these people. And then it was those people, it was those grocers and those postmen and those teachers and those people who would form the lynch mob that would then lynch this Black person. So the way that white supremacy attempts to hide itself, I think it was that sort of spectacle that you all created, I think was really moving. And when we think about, part of what you all are trying to do is you were trying to illuminate the messages that these statues or this flag was sending. And part of the question that we're asking now is, well, I think more people are clearer than ever that Confederate iconography, not all people, but more people are clear that Confederate iconography is a harmful part of our landscape. But there's often this conversation, well, what should be part of our landscape? Like, what should the iconography of our neighborhoods and towns and cities look like? I'm curious what each of you think about, like, when you imagine new sorts of monuments, when you imagine new sorts of iconography, what kind of things are you imagining? What kind of things are you thinking about? What should we be? I'm struck by the way that historian David Blight has this idea that we should maybe be creating monuments and memorials to ideas and aspirations, right? Not just like thinking about our past, but what would it look like to create iconography that's trying to point us in the direction that we should go, that maybe we haven't been. How are each of you thinking about that? Bree?
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I think, first of all, I love everything that Emil said and lifted up, because the question of not only what have we built monuments to, but what have we not been built monuments to, and why is so important. The role that monuments and iconography play in constructing how we understand history, which is also critical to how we understand where we are presently. I mean, the whole reason that the Confederate monuments were erected in the first place was really as a campaign for establishing, the post-Reconstruction world of Jim Crow. I mean, that's really what it was about. It was as much about establishing a modern system of structural racism as it was ever about, any kind of real historical remembrance. And I personally love the idea of rethinking the entire way that we use public space, that we construct public space, that we memorialize things. I think we should acknowledge too that this idea of building monuments is really an element of colonization. That's not something that really existed in this way prior to European colonization. And a lot of it, not to say, I just want to be clear, not to say that there are not other cultures or societies that engaged in building monuments, obviously. But when we're talking about in the situation of America, for instance, right? Continental America and how monuments exist here, a lot of that is a direct byproduct of colonization. And it has often been about idealizing particular figures, which I think goes to the way that the society itself is kind of organized around these kind of capitalistic ideas of individualism, of white patriarchy, the idea that we have supreme white men who are, elevated above the rest of humanity. And then we have the masses of people who are poor, who are overwhelmingly Black and brown, who are kind of forgotten and excluded from the definition of humanity. And so I like the idea of going even a step beyond what individual figures, right, do we memorialize to elevate alongside the white men or in replace of those white men, and instead think of how do we transform public space in a way that honors and celebrates the ideals of humanity, or the inclusion of everyone. I've seen, for instance, some people suggest that we create parks that have things that everybody can use, like, edible trees, just really kind of radical reimagining around the designs of cities and public spaces is something that's really fascinating to me. I'm not an urban planner or urban designer, but it's one of those things that I'm really fascinated to follow the conversation of the people who do kind of focus on those things. And I think that, in my view, that is the real way forward. I think sometimes we approach problems by trying to identify what is their equal and opposite, right? So we take down a statue of Robert E. Lee and we replace it with a statue of Harriet Tubman, right? But I think that there is a way to be more expansive and more creative in our approach to it. And I think it goes to that question of how are we honoring the idea of humanity itself? How are we creating spaces that are really open and inviting to everyone and in ways that everyone can use? Because I think there's also an environmental issue to be raised there about space and clearing space out to create statuary, right? As opposed to things that are a little bit more biophilic, things that would, be more climate friendly. I'm excited for a conversation that is really about going kind of post-colonization in our thinking about these things.
Emil?
I was just gonna say I really liked what Bree had to say, especially in regards to the role that monuments play in recent history. I think people have always had shrines and things to remember their dead, their values by, that they put in prominent places. It's a relatively new phenomenon to put monuments, especially of people, and especially of figures who fought in war, in front of courthouses or in front of schools. And in fact, like the first Confederate monuments, but I wouldn't call them monuments, were just grave sites, really, to memorialize the dead. And so I want to also put that in mind, that there was a more concentrated state effort to build these monuments. And so I think intention is important. I agree with the idea of values. I got to talk to Ziana Bryant at Monument Lab, who is from Charlottesville, and I think put in the original petition to change the Robert E. Lee Monument. And she had quite a lot to say about her family and their history in Charlottesville, and a lot of that, how that's been covered up. The Vinegar Hill neighborhood, James Henry Jones, a number of things that are Charlottesville history that don't represent the Black community who's lived there for a very long time at all. What we did, in terms of the Silent Sam Monument being toppled, right now we have a huge caper on our hands where UNC almost paid the Sons of Confederate Veterans $2.5 million to take the monument back. Luckily, some students blocked that with a civil injunction. But in my opinion, people ask me what should be done with that monument. I think people should leave it toppled where it was when it fell to the ground, because I think that in itself is a monument or a memorial to something. And I think that UNC getting rid of it was convenient for UNC, because not only did the monument disappear, but the history of contention around the monument disappeared when it was taken away. And as well, we created a number of monuments to James Cates, a sit-in activist, a Black sit-in activist who was murdered by a white motorcycle gang on UNC's campus in 1970. We put a monument to a Black woman who was beaten in the dedication speech to Silent Sam, right next to a monument to Jefferson Davis. And magically, both those monuments disappeared the next day. So I think monuments can be strategic, and the use of monuments to uncover hidden histories can really challenge the status quo. And I think that's what we should also be thinking about. Are we asking people to be quiet, or are we actually, creating controversy and actually exposing the things that we don't really want to talk about in our city.
It's interesting because part of what I found, you mentioned the Sons of Confederate Veterans. For one of my chapters, what I did, I went to the Blandford Cemetery, which is not far from Charlottesville. It's in Petersburg, Virginia. It's one of the largest Confederate cemeteries in the country, where the remains of 30,000 Confederate soldiers are buried. And I spent the day with the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and it was so it was both unsettling, but also incredibly clarifying and incredibly illuminating, because it made clear, I think, the way that for so many people, history is not about primary source documents or empirical evidence. It is a story that they are told, and it is a story that they tell. It is an heirloom that is passed down across generations. It's something where loyalty and family and lineage take precedence over truth. And so I always remember this conversation I had with a guy named Jeff, who's a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and he talked to me about talked about the cemetery as the sacred place, right? Almost as if the cemetery itself was a sort of church. And there was a church on the cemetery, and I think that the entire space was made by the people coming to spend time there to feel as if they were spending time in a holy space. And I think that part of that holiness and part of that, the sanctity of the space as they understood it, informed their a deep rejection of things that were right in front of them, right? So we know, and we've talked about how it's not unclear or vague why the Confederacy seceded from the Union. They wrote about it very explicitly. In 1861, a state like Mississippi says in their Declaration of Confederate Secession, our position is thoroughly aligned with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world, right? So they're not opaque about this. They're very direct. Like, this is why we are seceding. This is why the war is fought. But for so many people like Jeff, it doesn't matter, right? Because that's where his grandfather sang him the old Dixie anthem. This is where his grandmother would take him to give flowers to the men who fought to preserve the South and fought to preserve Southern culture and fought to, and so it's this, for so many people, it is to have to accept a new and more expansive and more honest history about this country is not just an inconvenient, doesn't just require an inconvenient reassessment of this country's history. It becomes like an existential crisis. It becomes, it is their religion. It is the thing that they have lived by and created definition and purpose and value for themselves that is under threat. And I'm wondering how each of you think about like the sort of the identity piece of it, and not identity in the way that it's often used, like identity politics, to sort of dismiss much of the, so many of the issues that are central in our political discourse now. But like, how are you thinking about what it means to like strip the sanctity from, in some ways, with your actions, to strip the sanctity from, and to make clear that these things that are rendered holy, when they are manifestations of harm, like physical manifestations of real historic harm, how are you thinking about the sort of relationship between those two things, and this idea of sort of desacralizing the Confederacy through your actions with these monuments and flags?
I guess I can go. You touched on so much there. I think it is identity politics. I think that one of the things that we have to do is not hold whiteness in this special crystal box, right? That is above everybody else's sense of identity. So if we're talking about what it means to be Black, or what it means to be queer, or what it means to be Buddhist, that somehow that is an otherized kind of identity. That stuff is identity politics, and white supremacy is some other thing. And I don't think it is. And I think that again, when we're talking about documented history, we have documented history around the construction of white identity. This is a very modern phenomenon, whether people are operating with a historical consciousness of it or not. And I think the whole conversation around what is history and how does it operate is a powerful one. I mean, that obviously, you know, could be its own panel, own course, just talking about that concept itself. Because oftentimes, even though we do have, you know, primary source material and these, you know, I think kind of more modern ideas around what history is, for much longer in human history and our understanding of who we are in culture, history has been an oral tradition. It's an oral tradition. It's something that was focused more on ideas than, you know, specific facts. Facts for you know, most of human history were not really what mattered as much as the overall concepts that were being communicated about who we are and how we are, and, you know, the place and times that we exist in. And I think that the reason that, you know, the Confederacy and other things tied to whiteness and white supremacy are able to kind of be held as sacrament is simply because it's the dominant culture. You know, I mean, when something is the dominant culture, when it is the system that is held in place and normalized through a process of colonization, and the status quo is upheld on a daily basis through, you know, state-sponsored violence, it's the thing that goes unquestioned. You know, the fact that here we are in 2021 and we're still having this conversation around Confederate monuments and trying to demystify you know, the history, recent history, you know, history of like the past 200 or so years, I think speaks to the fact that this violence is still very much in place, and it is what dominates our discourse and even sets the boundaries around what we are allowed to discuss. You know, I think Emil raised such a great point about how you had a situation where people were coming onto the campuses, right, with Confederate flags and nooses to, you know, pay homage at the site of the Silent Sam statue. But the police were mobilized against the counter protesters. Okay, so that you were talking about a situation where the state apparatus itself is organized around the specific belief system. And we're not even allowed to name the belief system as a belief system because we are simply supposed to hold it as reality, as the ultimate reality. It's not a religion, it's not a politic, it's not a constructed identity, it's simply the way that it is. God is white, and, you know, the patriarch is white, and everything else that has existed before or after is, you know, some other thing. It's the thing that is otherized, it's the thing that is named. You know, there's the African American Museum, right? And then there's the official museum. There's the Black history, and then there's the official history. There's the list of, you know, what Black people consider to be essential texts, and then there are the official text. And all of that is just the defining elements, in my view, of colonization, of white settler colonialism. So I think that one of the main ways that we desacralize something is to name it and identify it as a thing. I would classify white supremacy as a religion. And I mean, this is something, I know I'm not the only person to speak on this. There are scholars who can probably do a better job of speaking on it than I can, but I certainly think that white supremacy meets the definition of a religion. And I would say that it is the dominant religion. You know, people oftentimes identify it as Christianity. We have this conversation going on right now, in particular about evangelical Christianity in America. And I think part of that is also about us going through a process where we are naming specific theologies, that we are getting to a point where we are no longer forced in the same way to adopt a particular white-centered theology as the definition of Christianity. But I absolutely think that white supremacy is a religion. I think the belief in whiteness as a reality is an ideology. It's not a biological fact, right? This is an ideology that carries myths and religious beliefs. And that's exactly, I think, what you're speaking to, Clint, when you're talking about how, you know, you can present people with concrete facts and they dismiss that, because to embrace that is to pose an existential threat to their complete understanding of who they are in the world and in the universe. And I think that's what we are coming up against when we are talking about taking down a monument. It's never just about the monument.
Mm.
It's about the deconstruction of this ideology of whiteness that has informed the organizing of the modern world. It's so pervasive that it is difficult in a lot of ways for people to even get into, because the boundaries that have been constructed around us tell us that we are supposed to view everything through this lens where we accept whiteness as a real thing, and as the defining or as the definition really of what it means to be human, to be civilized, and to be right. Right.
I want to hop in briefly and let people know that we'll be transitioning to audience Q&A soon. And so if you have a question, please put the question in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. We're going to be transitioning to Q&A in about 6 or 7 minutes. And I'm sure you all have many questions for these two activists and thought leaders. Emil, I want to pivot for a moment. And I was struck by the way that you mentioned how, if I understood it correctly, part of the inspiration for the red paint and the blood was what you had seen in China, and I'm really interested in this idea of putting these actions and putting these monuments and putting the struggle against this sort of iconography in a larger global context. You know, one of the places that I went for my own book was Gorée Island, off the coast of Dakar, Senegal. And there was this profound moment where the person I was spending time with looked up, and we were standing under the street name of someone who was a French colonizer. And he was like, you know, you all are trying to, you know, get rid of the street names and statues of people who enslaved you. And we're trying to get rid of the statues and names and street names of people who colonized us, right? Who like exploited our labor, who exploited our resources, who stripped us of our human and material resources. And I'm wondering if you can speak, as you know, as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about histories of other places, if you can think about the way that the struggle here is in conversation with a larger global struggle against oppression.
Yeah, sorry, I had muted for a second. Yeah, I guess I would begin by saying that white supremacy, like capitalism, is a global phenomenon. You can't escape it, no matter where you are. It will affect you in different ways. In the same way, a lot of these phenomenons and a lot of the oppressions we're dealing with, you know, someone in China can understand, even if it's not necessarily related to Blackness. And for me, that relates in terms of like what, you know, value the state has in these kinds of interactions. And I think Bree mentioned that already. And I know there's a famous quote, and I'm sure someone else knows the name of who exactly said it. But a very famous Black man once said that if a white man hates me, that's his problem. If he has power, then it's my problem. And I think that the way in which, you know, I don't want to get too esoteric. The way in which modern empire works is that history is going to be revised. And people whose lives are lost in the process of making empire, of making industry, of making capital, are going to be lost and are going to be purposely suppressed in that process. So, you know, you have, you know, people in Ferguson in 2015 talking about police militarization, talking about tear gas, talking about similar manufacturers to the same people who are in Hong Kong, talking about tear gas, talking about, you know, police militarization. And also talking about their histories not being heard because they're not convenient to the nation. You know, I don't want to get too much into Chinese history because, you know, I don't want to.
With the next panel.
Yeah, I don't want to combine them too much, but I think that there is a strategy for people who are experiencing these things in these contexts to use these tools of revision for themselves, to turn it on its head. And maybe it gets also into your question for Bree about sacred items, because for what I thought about when you're talking about that, I thought about the a lot of this. If anyone's ever heard of this, I'm not a union supporter. I'm anti-white supremacy. President Lincoln hung 38 men in Mankato, and after that, a series of spoons commemorizing the hangings were sent out. So these kinds of items, not only, why is it so important to have a teaspoon with men hung on it? What does that do? I mean, it's dehumanizing. So these kinds of events that happen in order to, make control better, to make people who are inconvenient less able to have their rights, are also memorialized and sold to the populace as kind of novelties. And so I think that's what the statues are as well. And I think if you're looking globally, you can analyze that similarly in other countries as well, who have dealt with similar issues of white supremacy and legalizing against a whole class or race of people.
It's so interesting. I spent a lot of time thinking about obviously all of what we're talking about is embedded in racial capitalism. And I saw that I think maybe most profoundly when I went to visit Angola prison in Louisiana, which is, for people who don't know, Angola is the largest maximum security prison in the country, 18,000 acres wide, bigger than the island of Manhattan. It's a place where 75% of the people held there are Black men. Over 70% of them are serving life sentences. And it is built on top of a former plantation. What I always tell folks is that if you were to go to Germany and you have the largest maximum security prison in Germany, and it was built on top of a former concentration camp in which the people held there were disproportionately Jewish, that place would quite rightfully be a global emblem of anti-Semitism. It would be abhorrent. It would be disgusting. We would never allow a place like that to exist because it would so clearly run counter to all of our moral and ethical sensibilities. And yet here in the United States, we have the largest maximum security prison in the country, where the vast majority of people are Black men serving life sentences, many who work in fields of people who work in fields of what was once a plantation, many of whom were sentenced as children, many of whom were sentenced by non-unanimous juries, which has since been rendered unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States. And I bring it up because of that context, but specifically in this idea of the way that capital intersects with oppressive systems. This prison has a gift shop, and inside the gift shop, visitors can come in and they can purchase coffee mugs and shot glasses and baseball caps and sweatshirts and stuffed animals dressed in prison garb. And on some of the coffee mugs and shot glasses and t-shirts, they have the silhouette of a watchtower. And above and below the watchtower, it says Angola, a gated community, right? As if to make a mockery of or belittle the experiences of the thousands of people, the hundreds of thousands of people who have been incarcerated there over the course of decades. And it reminds me of the spoons you mentioned, right? Because it's this idea, when I was there, I was like, what would compel someone to buy a t-shirt that is making a mockery of this system that is so clearly, as the scholar Saidiya Hartman says, embodied by the afterlife of slavery? Right? And it's not a metaphor, the land makes it literal, but it's this idea of, almost the same way that like when after lynchings, how people would take parts of the rope as souvenirs, right? And parts of the body as souvenirs, right? The spectacle, it's like the spectacle of capital, like the thing, the demonstration that like, I have been to this site that has enacted terror, and I am now, and like I'm taking something from it to make me feel more proximate to it, which is to say, to make me feel more proximate to the power that it is attempting to wield. So I think that's so fascinating. I wish we had more time to get into that, but I want to make sure the audience has time for questions. And our first one is, do Bree and Emil have models or inspirations for their activism?
Yes, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I really do tend to think in the collective sense more than the individualistic. And so I view everything that I do as being part of a continual struggle of masses of people, some of who I know, many more who I do not know and cannot name. Even when I was, scaling the pole, I felt spiritually like the presence of so many people. I can name my ancestors, I can name some of my ancestors, at least the last generation that was held in slavery, and their children that I am descended from, who were held on a plantation in South Carolina. And so for me, it is about the continual struggle of my family, but then also this broader struggle of humanity. I know I keep saying like I agree with Clint and Emil, but obviously, and I think that Emil's point about the global nature of the struggle of humanity against an oppressive state apparatus that does not honor human rights or individual freedom, that's how I define my struggle. There's like there's how I fit into it specifically as a Black woman in America, descended from people who were held in slavery here. But I also see myself as being part of a global struggle of many people who have experienced colonization or the oppression of empires or genocide and violent states. And so I draw my inspiration from all of that.
Mm. Yeah.
So I am very lucky that I had, examples like Bree and Takia Thompson before my action took place. And so, for me, that was a really big push for me to see two other people do something, that was equally kind of inspiring and brave, and resituated those very racist icons into something about Black power, perhaps, or the ability to triumph over them. So I'm very lucky in that regard. And in the regard that, I sat at that statue every day, almost for a year, handing out information. And during that time, I was inspired by a lot of anonymous Black people, because there's a lot of Black people who live in Chapel Hill. Although they're incredibly surveilled every time they come on campus or in Franklin Street and harassed by police, they pass by that statue. And there are a number of people who, in the same way that, I'm talking to PhD students, I'm talking to white professors and they want me to explain racism, and I'm talking to Black people who, work on campus in the dining hall. Something that really keeps the campus running 24/7. And their first reaction to the statue is spitting on it. And saying, I know exactly what this means. I know exactly what it's telling me every day when I see it here. I saw a number of people use a pocket knife to take a chunk out of the statue. UNC, despite having spending $500,000 on police presence that year around the statue, couldn't prevent people from interacting with it because it is such a symbol of hate. So I think that for me, people have been doing this for a long time. I'm really lucky that my name got put out there. But there are so many other Black people who have done this and whose names are not known, but are very, very brave.
I'm so struck by the sort of metaphor, and excuse I've been trying to figure out this whole time how to navigate the sun coming in from my blinds, but I'm so struck by this metaphor of everyday Black folks in Chapel Hill walking by this statue and picking it apart pocket knife piece by pocket knife piece, which I think is so emblematic of how social change has always happened, right? This idea that sometimes what is remembered is the large public spectacle or the single person or the single event or the single moment. But as you all have, you're both so thoughtful and so humble and so clear that the work that you have done is only one manifestation of the work that Black folks have been doing and continue to do across this country in all of these small ways, and all of these ordinary folks just chipping away, right, at this statue, chipping away at this wall, chipping away at these things. Because a metaphor that I often use is all of us are here and we're chipping away at this wall, and we don't know what this wall is 6 inches thick or 60 miles thick, but we know that the more that we chip away at it, the less the people who come after us will have to chip away at, right? And we are part of this intergenerational struggle in which we are trying to build the sort of world that we are cognizant of the fact that we might not see ourselves, but we know that someday someone will. Because our conversation here, like we're only able to have this conversation right now because generations of Black folks were chipping away at this wall and we're fighting for a world that they might never see, but they fought for it anyway. And I think that part of what you all's work does is so profoundly embody the sense that sense of your ability to like situate yourself as part of this tradition, and also to recognize the responsibility it bestows upon you to like try to do the work that our ancestors in so many ways did for us. I would love to hear, and so would Bobby Collier, about books or videos or media, one that have been like particularly impactful for you on this front, and then secondly, and it might be the same thing, that have been that you think would be helpful resources for the audience to learn more about the relationship between statues and history and how we think about how iconography shapes the way that we make sense of our society.
I want to answer that. I wanted to point out one thing though, because I think you both lifted up a really important point about how the monuments are never just symbols, but they are an essential apparatus of how racial capitalism operates. So they spent $500,000 on protecting a statue, right? That's $500,000 that could have gone to housing for the Black community, that could have gone to a lot of other public services. The amount of money that is spent on paying police to guard inanimate properties, monuments to slavery instead of the people, that's not just a symbol. That is like a part of the economic structure, the oppressive economic structure. And I just wanted to point that out because I think that's really important. And then in terms of like films and books and things that have kind of helped me in my understanding, not directly related to statuary or even slavery, but honestly, Pedagogy of the Oppressed was one of those books that I read that was really mind-blowing for me, like mind-shifting. You've probably had in your own experience, there are certain things that you encounter and you remember when you first encountered it, just because it was like this moment where it completely shifted your thinking. And that was one that I got introduced to when I first got involved in activism. And it was mind-opening for me because it helped me to see that there is no such thing as apolitical education. And so when we understand that there is no such thing as a politically neutral way of framing our understanding of the world through formal education, that is what allowed me to recognize that there had been boundaries set around my understanding of history, and I received a pretty good education in America, I even received an education where they did teach us about, slavery, and it wasn't completely, whitewashing of history, but it still wasn't a complete telling of history. And I didn't even realize until I became fully involved in movement organizing how much we are not taught about things, especially the labor struggle. We are really not ever taught about the labor struggle. We are generally not taught about other systems of governance. We're definitely not taught things that challenge capitalism as, representing the full extent of, advancement in civilization, or like the only way that the world can be organized and operate. And so that is definitely one that I would point to. The Half Has Never Been Told is another one that I often recommend to people, just to understand how central slavery is to global capitalism and how it came to be, because that's another thing that I think is often whitewashed in history. We're kind of taught that industrialization is something separate from slavery, or we are taught that, slavery was just kind of this thing that happened, and then it became, because it wasn't sustainable, that is what gave way to industrialization. And that's really not true. And it helps you to understand why anti-Black racism is global, and the connections between anti-Black racism and globalism. And then the last thing I would recommend is Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson. which is also helping to kind of challenge, I think, a lot of our understandings of history. A lot of times the way that we learn history excludes the history of enslaved people and understanding like that greater struggle against what we identify as the capitalist system.
And that's for folks to say again, Pedagogy of the Oppressed is by Paulo Freire. The Half Has Never Been Told is by Edward Baptist, historian at Cornell. Remarkable. Both of those are transformative. I think we have like the same set of transformative books. And then Cedric Robinson, obviously Black Marxism. And as I think about the relationship between capitalism and racism, as is outlined in those latter two books so clearly, people aren't clear on that. About how in 1860, the 4 million enslaved Black people were worth more than every bank, factory, and railroad combined, worth more than all the manufacturing in this country total. Like, we're the bodies of enslaved people on the brink of the Civil War. So there is no, I think sometimes people can say it as an abstraction, right? Like, oh, this country was built on the backs of Black people, but like, no, like economically, the nature of how the US became a global economic superpower is inextricably linked to 250 years of exploitative racial capitalistic torture. And I also think part of what Edward Baptist does so well in that book is like outline how slavery was a system of capitalism, and part of that capitalistic incentive was to create plantations, which were sites of torture, to get as much labor from people as possible and to create new. And there's an argument he makes about how so much of the innovation that would give rise to the innovation of the industrial age, of the late 19th of the 18th and 19th century, came from enslavers trying to figure out the most creative ways to extract as much labor as possible from their enslaved workers. And both of those books talk about that so well. So I'm glad you recommended those. Emil, do you have a couple?
Yeah, I was just gonna suggest maybe sources, some sources that have been created, recently. I again want to point out Ziana Bryant, who's a local activist to Charlottesville. And I know that they have stuff on social media where they talk quite a bit about what's going on. A number of the people who are, recording what's going on in the Science versus Kessler trial are also, this all has to do with the monument as well. And some of these things that are happening in small towns happen everywhere in the US. A documentary that was produced actually by a number of documentary students at UNC featuring poetry by Black UNC students, called the Silent Sam documentary, was the best documentary I've ever seen about American Confederate monuments, and it was made by undergrads. For me, some of the first opportunities I had to actually learn the most about North Carolinian history, that Haitian history, was through making connections and becoming active in the supporting people in jail and civil rights in jail. The first time I ever heard about the Greensboro massacre, in which police led the KKK to murder communist activists who were helping feed people essentially in Greensboro, was in a prison letter. Blood in My Eye by George Jackson. So many of those things, because so often when I come into spaces, especially on academic campuses, I think like people who are activists are kind of seen as kooky, emotional, too invested, and I am more wary of people who are not invested in this, things that are life and death struggles. I think you cannot enter into this kind of a thing without taking a side. Because to be an observer in a struggle for life and death for Black people, to me, means that you're already against me, So I would actually encourage people to, really actually follow and, support like activists doing things in your city, and especially people who are being arrested for that.
It's it makes me think a lot about this idea that Du Bois would often talk about, how people would refer to say that his research and his sociological work and his historical work was compromised or couldn't be taken seriously because of his quote unquote proximity to the issue, right? And I think it goes back to what Bree was saying before. It's like, well, why are we thinking of, like, if we're thinking about racism, why is Blackness more proximate to racism than whiteness? Like whiteness is what created racism. So how is Du Bois able to be less less objective, so to speak, even though objectivity is made up, but like this idea that Du Bois is any less able to engage with this subject matter than so many of the white sociologists and historians who created the history that perpetuated so much of the lost cause narrative over the course of time, right? The idea that they were objective, that Ulrich B. Phillips, who was the sort of leading historian in the early 20th century around slavery, that he was objective when he said that slavery was a civilizing institution that gave Black people access to religion and civilization and put them in stable communities and homes where they were in their most natural habitat. The idea that that is more objective than Du Bois, or than Zora Neale Hurston experienced this when she was studying anthropology at Columbia University. And so it's something that is so omnipresent in the Black activists and intellectual tradition. And it's fascinating to think of the way that continues to be the case. Because I came from a PhD world and life in academia not that long ago, and I felt that also, right? The way that activism was seen as kind of compromising the intellectual rigor of your work, and that being dispassionate was ostensibly reflective of being more rigorous, which is in so many ways, as you mentioned, counterintuitive. This is a conversation that I wish we could just like keep having and keep going. I want to know so much more about China. I want to know so much more about Bree, the role that your faith plays in this, because I know you're very open about that. We will have to save that for the next time. Hopefully UVA will bring us back, and I would like to pass it on to back to them to wrap us up.
Thank you for this really stimulating conversation, to our guests, Bree Newsome-Bass, Emil Little, and Clint Smith. I want to thank the Memory Project manager, Dr. Claire Payton, our co-host, the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab, and thank you to the audience for taking time out of your day to attend Down with Confederacy. And I invite you to check out our website, democracyinitiative.virginia.edu, for upcoming events that are hosted by the Memory Project and the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab at the UVA Democracy Initiative. And we hope to see you again. Have a nice afternoon.